All right, welcome everybody. We have here with us today AD Dietrich, and is it Dietrich or Dietrich?
Dietrich.
Dietrich, AD Dietrich, thank you. And Chris Straley, I said that correct as well, right?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. I know Chris because I had interviewed him for the webinars that I have been doing, or actually I think we didn't do a webinar, I think we actually did a blog post on your experience leaving from teaching, coming into the role you're in now, and I've seen you at a few conferences here and there, so really excited to see what you have to share with us this evening. And Chris, it looks like I think you might be the only one here right now, so feel free if you have any questions. This is supposed to be very informal. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions or type them into the chat, and if you type them into the chat, I'll do my best to ask them as needed during breaks and good times. And we usually are done by 8 o'clock, if not before. There's no time limit specific onto that or anything, but we will go ahead and you guys can get started. And I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. I'll leave my video on for a little while and help out here and there. Let me know if you have any questions, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris. Since we have a very intimate group, I just reach out and ask you, what do you hope to get out of the session tonight? Because I'll make sure that we try to tailor it as much as we can to what you're looking to get.
Well, most recently, I'm taking a dive back into the learning and development world, and I saw that this topic seemed a bit interesting, so I figured I'd join up and see what it was all about. So anything that has to do with learning and development, I'm just trying to absorb as much as I can. So,
all right, perfect. So, as Carrie mentioned there in the intro, my background initially was in secondary education, and so my undergrad degree is in English language and literature. Then went and got a master's in education, and I taught high school English, speech, journalism, pretty much anything in the language arts field for about 6 years. And I was doing instructional design work on the side to supplement the killer teacher income. You know how that goes. And essentially, I ended up doing it for a full year in between undergrad and grad, then was just doing it part-time, like I said, to supplemental income. And when I decided to leave teaching, I knew I wanted to stay in an educational space because it wasn't like I was disgusted with the field or anything like that. I was just looking for a little bit more of a change. For me personally, it was the repetition of, if you have year after year where you're pulling 5 sessions of freshman English, you're going to read Lord of the Flies like 45 times. And so it was just something where I was looking to branch out a little bit, but still stay in the space education because that's what I love doing.
Completely understand. That's great.
No, thank you. Absolutely. From there, I took a role at Bath & Body Works and their store operations group doing training for pretty much everything that doesn't involve selling the lotion. It's all the background stuff. So workforce management, inventory management, how they would restock the floors, setting them up for their national sales meetings, things like that. And so I did that role for about 4 years, then moved over to Cardinal Health, where I ran 3 different training teams, each aligned to different spaces. One was IT, another was focused on data analytics, and a third was focused on just generalized soft skills. So if you think about like presentation, managing conflict, things like that. And so that's my background. AD, before I proceed, I just want to give a little bit of a bio for you.
Yeah, similar. I taught school originally, but I didn't last nearly as long as most people. So I taught for a year at a school in North Carolina for troubled kids, either getting in or going out of the penal system in the state of North Carolina. It only lasted about a year for me, and then I wanted to get into training, and I assumed I would be getting into facilitation, but the company I worked for here in Ohio, the only role they had open was for a curriculum developer. And so I took the role, figured I could learn a little bit about it, and very quickly found myself in a role where I had to identify, did the training work? You know, was there an impact of the training? Was the training useful? And that was 21 years ago. And so I've spent the last 21 years pretty much exclusively in the space of measuring the effectiveness of learning. Got into consulting about 9 years ago. And then I've been in the consulting space and then opened my company 3.5 years ago and devoted specifically to measuring the effects of training, the impact of training, the quality of learning, all of that. So I've been really specifically in the measurement space almost my entire time in the learning field.
So just to kind of dive right in, since we're just going to be informal and have a conversation, I think more than anything, are you familiar with the Kirkpatrick measurement model at all?
Yes, actually I am.
Perfect. So obviously it's the most used by far. Oh, go back there. I'm going to try to minimize these videos a little bit. All right, there we go. That's better. So it's the most used model in the learning and development space. It's very practical. It's not without flaws, but essentially just quick review. When you hear people throwing around the levels, they're generally referring to how they correspond to each of these things and then the question that it answers. This for me is the really more important piece, is to think about it in terms of what are you actually answering when you measure at a particular level. Most organizations are pretty good about doing level ones, not necessarily saying their survey quality is pretty good, but they're at least attempting level ones. That's your smile sheets, or if they're done better, valid surveys in terms of how did you feel about the training experience? Do you have an intention to go apply what you learned in this class? Providing facilitator feedback, things like that. Level 2 is really AD's domain, where he's one of the best experts I know in this space of psychometrics. And this is all about, did knowledge transfer occur? And the reason I referred to psychometrics there is tests, quizzes, interactive activities that have right and wrong answers and choices. Those are all some of the most common examples of how we would go about and measure learning within the learning experience itself. So kind of like traditional schooling, it tends to take place in a safe environment, right? There's no consequence immediate anyway. If you don't answer the question correctly, the operations in the back room aren't going to fall apart. But it's a good way to just check, did any actual knowledge transfer take place, which you must know before you can really measure at the higher levels. So one of the things that I would point out about this, if you're doing measurement correctly, you should really be applying each level as you go, not just try to skip to a top one. Impact, think about impact of you're observing it. Now the learner is actually applying the behavior on the job. So if there was a training that was all about, hey, here's the new technique to go ahead and sell that new scent at Bath & Body Works. When they come in, we want you to greet the customer with these 3 specific behaviors. If you were the floor manager and you're just observing your employees, they do something called figure 8s, right? Where they'll have their sales leads go around and just observe. That would be a perfect example of a level 3. We're seeing, is the behavior that we taught in the learning actually being applied in the way that we hope it will be? And then, did that actually result in anything? There's your level 4. Can we measure the impact on performance? And then the gold standard, ROI, can we actually assign a dollar figure to it? One thing I will say, just as a general rule of thumb, the higher you go, the less often you're going to either need to get to that level of measurement or derive value from that level of measurement. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we go. But essentially, no learning team should be setting out to try to do ROI analysis on 100% of their projects, because it would actually produce a negative ROI in some cases, particularly with smaller projects. All right. This is a couple of stats that I got from the State of the Industry report from ATD. This is actually a year old, but it is startling. One of the conversations that you hear in the corporate world a lot from learning and development folks is, we don't feel super valued. We feel like we're more just a cost center. Training gets cut when budgets get hard, things like that. This is part of the reason for that. I'm not saying it's the whole reason, but it is part of it. And that's because business impact and ROI, while being desired by lots of leaders, of course, they want to know that the money they're investing in their training departments is producing results. Only 8%, when they took the survey, saw business impact, 4% saw an actual ROI. So you can imagine what that conversation looks like with your CFO when they're looking at a multi-million-dollar training budget for the year and they're trying to justify their spend. Well, how do we prove the results? And again, you don't always have to get to this level, but you have to be able to show that you're making a difference. Just a couple more quick stats. So what do they industry leaders recommend? The first one's kind of like a yeah, duh, but believe it or not, a lot of times people miss it, which is aligning your learning strategy to the business goals. Top priority. And this amazed me. And I know AD and I have had conversations about this in the past because we were just stunned that this seemed like secret knowledge to so many people that you should be aligning the learning strategy to your business goals. But 36% were doing it as of the 2018 study. And then organizations that actually took the time to do that were 40% more likely to actually see results. And so, again, it just kind of feeds into that dynamic of there's steps we can take to really help ourselves, at least when it comes to proving our value. So I kind of put this in here a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. Organizations don't train employees for the sake of building knowledgeable, well-rounded citizens. That's called school, right? That's what you hope to get out of your university experience, your secondary experience, et cetera. When you're working for Amazon, they're not looking for well-rounded citizens. They're looking for, are you producing results for us? So that means, all right, let's look at the areas where we actually do apply training to try to drive a result. Implementation of new technology is a huge one. I'm on a tech-based learning project right now for a company here in Columbus. Anytime a new process is put in place, people need to learn how to execute the new steps. Remediation of detrimental behavior, compliance, and this is an area in which AD specializes. And there's a huge implication here because the amount of fines that you can actually accrue can lead up into the billions, and that's billions with a B, if you're not very careful about how you go about training your people. And then speed to competency, how quickly can we get the new employees up and running to where we're trying to get them? Those would all be really good examples of what it does make sense to measure in a corporate environment. So what should drive measurement? Enterprise strategy, initiative prioritization, dynamic adjustments, training investment optimization. What do I mean by that? So believe it or not, when I was at Cardinal Health and I was running those 3 teams, the vast majority of my time wasn't spent building the actual learning deliverables. I did that sometimes, but mostly it was around prioritizing and helping scope all the incoming requests. Because usually, as you know, training teams could be pretty lean within organizations. I've seen training teams of 1, which is incredibly lean. I've seen training teams with 100 people on it. That's the other extreme. Training investment optimization is really all about where can I make the biggest difference the fastest? And that's what should be driving not only your measurement approach, but does it make sense to dedicate training resources to this specific initiative? So one thing I didn't mention in my little intro there, one of the things that I learned when I was running these teams at Cardinal Health is that the project management around L&D played a critical role around not only being able to set yourself up for measurement, but minimizing the cost side of ROI. So everyone always thinks about, we need to prove the benefits, and that's right. However, there's also a cost side to the ROI equation. So theoretically, what you want to do is produce the best possible learning deliverable at the least cost and the least amount of time. And so after I worked at Cardinal for 4.5 years, I'm lucky in that my wife runs a successful company. I was able to step away for a year and really just spend a lot of time brainstorming how I would go about tackling this solution. And my company, Instructional Design Genius, was founded with the idea of providing project management for learning development, which would enable more cost-effective development of training solutions. So it's not a tool to actually produce the training itself, but think about the structure needed in order to build effective training and do things like align it to a learning objective or align your learning objective to your business goals. And so that's literally something that we do in our system. And if you are measuring, what are you trying to accomplish? What's the actual goal? So I don't want to turn this into a big commercial, but I just wanted to mention at least the background of that's where my foray into the measurement space really picked up steam. I'd done some in the past, but full time is when I started IDG. This is something that actually AD, I want to credit him, he gave me this quote and I ended up using it in a presentation for ATD out in Utah at a conference earlier this year. So you can see the image, learning development leads to behavior change, which leads to business goals. That's kind of the assumption of a lot of leaders and organizations, and it implies a linear relationship, and it assumes that nothing else is going on, right? So as learning and development improves, behaviors change, we achieve our business goals, hooray, right? That's not always necessarily the case. And by taking too simple of an approach, we're actually creating problems for ourselves. But if we distill it down to that simple of a statement. One other place that I wanted to mention where I think we run into problems a lot, what we're trying to measure. The first thing, and AD, tell me if you've had a different experience, but the first thing I would generally hear from senior leaders is, let's focus on how our learning is impacting sales or customer sentiment, right? They always go after the highest measure. Net promoter score gets thrown out a ton. And I could go on a whole diatribe about that, but I won't. This is usually not the most effective approach. Anyone want to just throw out a couple of thoughts about why going after sales as a measure of success for a learning project is probably not the way to go?
There's too many variables involved, and the market space changes and fluctuates, and those variables will inherently have a negative impact on whatever training you're developing, for the simple fact that the return on investment can't just be primarily through sales. I mean, there has to be other avenues in which you can measure it. And
that's one of the best answers I've heard. Seriously, you really hit it with the variables. That's dead on. And it's not even always that they're negative. Sometimes they can be positive. For example, one of my business partners, Andrew, he always throws up the example of Tickle Me Elmo, right? Because of that craze back in the 90s where imagine you created the worst sales training ever, but it's a hot product that everyone wanted that year. And so no matter how bad the sales experience was, people were going to buy that toy, right? Well, sales are going to be great because of people wanting the product. It has nothing to do with the fact that, oh, we created a great training experience. All kinds of external factors impact sales. It's about the highest level metric you can go after. I mean, you have macroeconomy implications, and you have company culture, micro, I could go on and on. So it's generally better when you're going after a specific measure to take a step down from these highest of measures. From here, I'm going to go into a real life example of something that we measure, but because it's a little bit more around a business measure, I think it makes sense to switch over to AD because he really does a fantastic job in that level 2 knowledge transfer space. And so I'd like him to kind of go through his stuff first if he could, because I think it sets us up better for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, sure. I think, well, let me share my screen real quick. So kind of, let's see, kind of following up on what Chris said, when we think about those Kirkpatrick levels, or even the way we have framed ROI as an industry and framed kind of our intention as an entity within corporations, we're basically setting up a model that says, I'm going to put some sort of metric around learning, around, well, I'll take a business need, I will create a learning event for it, and that learning event should enact some kind of business, some kind of personal behavioral change, which will eventually affect the business in a positive way, right? And the way we've set up measurement through Kirkpatrick or Phillips is this idea, and it's a justifiable idea given when those models were created, that what we'll do is we'll train people, we'll get some kind of metric that we trained them, and then we will measure the business, and then we'll measure that ultimate, kind of bottom line impact. And ideally, we'll see that correlation between the two. ROI says then what we'll do is we'll take these sometimes specious numbers, right? People completed training, people attended a class, people clicked a link, people downloaded a PDF. None of that really indicates that learning occurred. So we're basically saying, here are the things that we're measuring, and then we'll measure all the way to the business, and then we'll backtrack and try and control all those variables that you mentioned, right? And we'll try and remove all the variables that aren't about learning. It's a huge effort. It's a monumental effort in many cases. And the handful of ROI examples that I've seen that are really, really, really statistically sound, all of those required a lot of time and a lot of money. The other ones, the other ones always sort of have a huge margin of error to them. And so the focus, when we think about how that model was created in the 50s. Now, 20 years ago, when I started curriculum design and I started measurement, we were still doing paper-based tests, right? We'd create a test, the trainer would give the test, they would mark the test up in class, and then they'd throw the paper away. We didn't have data around did people learn. We didn't have a lot of observational forms. And if we did do observations, we didn't store them anywhere. Now that we're in a position to have data around how people are learning, how people are applying that learning all throughout this process, now we're in a position to say, rather than collect some metrics that may or may not indicate that learning occurred, and then try and backtrack from the business need to control all the other variables, why don't we just focus on did they learn? So that's a big part of what I end up doing, is focusing on how do we measure did people learn and can they apply it? And so some of that is through assessments that we give. Some of that is through observational assessments. So I want to see you do the tasks that we're asking you to do. And what we find now, and when we talk about data really transforming our industry, this is how. So now, instead of having to say, I know they attended training, I know they did something related to training, I don't know if they learned or not exactly, and I don't have a lot of evidence for that, but what I can do is I can start to control all these variables working backwards to give an indication that they learned and that I had value. We focus our clients on measuring learning in a really defensible way, statistically defensible way. So I'm very practiced, my practice is heavily focused on psychometrics, which is how do we assess people, how do we evaluate people, and then how do we put those assessments and evaluations through statistical analyses to be able to say, look, this person did learn. Not only did this person learn, this person was able to apply it. And when we're able to do that, now we're in a very different position than we've ever been, because now we're in a position to say, I'm going to shrink this a little so you can actually see the slide. I apologize. Now we're in a position, instead of training and hoping that there is a behavioral change that may or may not happen, because people may not have the motivation or the opportunity. I may know how to do something. There are plenty of things in this world I know how to do, but I don't have the motivation to do. There's a dusty treadmill sitting over in the corner that will attest to that right now. There are things I know how to do, but I don't maybe have the motivation to do, or there are things I know how to do, and sometimes I don't have the opportunity to do them on the job. And so I don't now need to control for those things. Now, instead, what we can do is we can measure, we can say with statistical confidence, Chris, Carrie, Chris, Gloria, they all know how to do this. If they're not doing it, now we're in a position to talk to the business about what might be affecting their motivation, what might be affecting their opportunity, what might be keeping them from applying these things. We've identified what the business impact is. We know what the goal is for the business. We know what the behaviors are that we want to see to feed into that. If we're not seeing something in that chain, we have an intelligent, measurable chain of evidence along the way, and we're not seeing it, now we can have a really informed discussion about what's going on with these learners. They know how to do it. Why aren't they doing it? So that's why I was kind of work with my clients that in training, we've always said, learning and development has always said, we're fighting for a seat at the table when it comes to impact and strategy. You shouldn't be fighting for a seat at the table. You should actually be leading that table. You should be sitting at the head of that table, having this discussion, because it all starts with people's ability, right? They have the knowledge, the skills, and the ability. We can attest to that. We have the numbers right here. Now let's talk about what's happening in behavior in the organization beyond learning that might be affecting that. And so that's really our big change. And so when we measure, as opposed to the old school way of just saying at the end of the course, we give a test. That's one measure, and that's an important measure. Absolutely, and I do that with a lot of my clients. So a big part is helping people understand how to write those assessments, but we also measure in this behavioral change area. So it's not just about at the end of course, take a test, have a nice day. It's also about then going back 30, 60, 90 days. And instead of just saying, do you know how to do it? Now I also need to observe you doing it. I need you to show me that you can apply it. And the ability to take those two data points and say, look, we trained you, you knew how to do it, you now know how to apply it. We should be seeing a behavioral change. We should be seeing that behavioral change lead to business impact becomes a much more credible discussion than let's wait to see if it has a business impact and then let's backtrack and remove as many variables as possible. Like Chris said, I do a lot of work in regulated spaces. And I just sort of found myself in this by accident, really. I mean, I was very good with psychometrics, and so we were getting calls from people to come in because huge fines were coming across from the government for situations that people had been trained on. In every case, people had been trained, they had signed off. And regulators, and by the way, if it's not regulators, it's civil courts. So what we're finding now is regulators say, well, we did tell them they had to sign off. We did tell them they had to train people on these things. And we did tell them that people had to complete the training. They did all those things and they still went out, and because opportunity, because of motivation, they went and did bad things. And the civil court said, yeah, the regulators can't fine you, but we can fine you because yeah, they signed off. Yeah, they took the course. Yeah, they completed it. Yeah, they have a record in the LMS. You can't tell me that they know how to do these things. And so that's where a lot of the work I'm doing anymore is coming from. People calling and saying, look, we've been giving people this compliance training for years, and suddenly the courts are fining us hundreds of millions of dollars. And they have to be able to now show regulators people did learn. Now, it doesn't always get rid of the problem, but it certainly gets rid of the problem from a learning and development perspective. So when regulators come back and say, why is this thing still happening? It's not because we didn't train you, because now we can show that. We can show that you learned. We can show that we trained you, and we can show that you learned it. And we can even show sometimes, in certain cases, we went back, we know they know how to apply it. So the problem really isn't about that. There's no way in the old models to show that. And so that's really what we're trying to help change as an organization. So when we write our assessments, we're really looking at psychometrics from about 4 different perspectives. So we run all our things through a battery of psychometric tests, and we're really trying to help understand that tests are fair, so they're not too easy, they're not too hard, right? We've all taken tests that especially around compliance, if we're being honest, right? We take those compliance tests where I didn't even pay attention to the course. I took the test. I got 100 right off the bat. We want to be able to know that tests are not too easy or not too hard. We want to know that the tests can distinguish between who are good learners and who are bad, because we want to be able to remediate the people who we know didn't learn. So we have to be able to pull that data out of there. And we want to know that each test is requiring people to really think about each answer. And then finally, statistical reliability is really where all of those tests work together to indicate that some learning has occurred. And so that's what we do, is we work with our clients, pulling all of that information together, taking all of those distinct independent tests, figuring out how they work interdependently, and then giving our clients some reports that really provide them with prescriptive, direct, easy to understand advice on here's how you can improve these tests. Here's how you can make your test more reliable statistically. Here's how you can get some really strong evidence that your people learned. So that's a critical part for us. And more importantly, here's what you can do about the people who didn't learn. So that we want to arm all of our clients, and we want to, when I think of transforming the industry with data, for me, it's all about arming people with the ability to have those discussions with the business about, look, I know they learned, what else might be going on that's keeping people from being successful? So that's a really critical part of what we do, is really arming people with that knowledge. So I've now rambled for 15 minutes.
So, no, sorry to interrupt you. No, it's super good. Carrie was asking, without naming names, could you perhaps give a application example of some of these compliance situations on which you work?
Yeah, can't name names, but well, there's some life sciences things that are going on. So healthcare.
I guess I should ask, is there something where there was some big fine going on, or you like a specific fine or specific issue that you were able to help turn around with this, that you can say without saying the name? If you can't say anything, like I don't know how public or non-public anything like that is, so if you can't say anything, that's totally fine. But I was just curious.
The one I can give you is the mortgage. The first client that was really big in this space was one of the big, one of a few people who was at the center of the mortgage crisis in 2008. And the government said, all of this crazy finance happened, and you were the people who were supposed to catch it, and you were the people who were supposed to stop this from happening, and your people didn't know how to do that. And they said, you need to figure out how to train your people so they know how to do that. Well, the first year, they turned around and said, okay, well, we're just going to train our people like crazy. We're going to put them through hundreds of hours of training. And literally, like, it was all hands on deck. Every consulting company I knew was building training for them, and they were putting people through all this training that they thought was missing. And at the end of the year, the regulator said, that's great that they've been through training. Do they know how to catch this stuff? And they said, well, yeah, we put them through all the training. And the regulator said, do they know how to, again, because they'd been through all the training before that was required. And that's when I got called in. They just said, can you help us figure this out? And that's when this whole process that we're seeing on the screen really started. The idea of, okay, what we need to be able to do is we need to measure, did they learn? And we have to be continually optimizing that process. So that client, I started working with them 2011, 2012, I think. And every year we go through all their tests, and we go through this process, and we go through it. And now they went from completely indefensible, statistically completely unable to say to regulators, yes, our people know. Now they have an academic standard. So now they're able to say, like the ACT or the SAT, like, yeah, we put them through. They know all of this stuff. If things aren't happening, it's not because they don't know it. It's because something else happened. And that was my first big client, and all the other ones have kind of followed with that. I think last year, my clients were, what was it, Crystal? Almost 10 billion in fines and civil fees.
Yeah, I mean, it was serious money.
They're big clients, and they're getting hit really hard in the courts. And so, I mean, I got, the SEC called me directly and said, you need to come and work with this client because they're screwing up. And so that's usually what it is that they need, some regulatory agency needs to know that their people know this. Doesn't mean that they won't do it, but if they are doing it, now we can focus on, do you have a management problem? Do you have an opportunity problem? Do you have a motivation problem? But the real key is they have to know it. And that's what this does, is it really gives them solid evidence that they know the material.
And this stuff isn't simple, so I think it's probably a good time to call out too. I know I certainly do this, and I believe AD does as well. Partner with people who are really experts in statistics when needed, right? Because a lot of these, some stats, within our purview for sure. I think we're both smart people, but some of this can get pretty in depth. And one of the things that I appreciate about AD's approach is he's tried to take a lot of psychometrically complex stuff and distill it down to action. So when you're seeing these numbers here, it's basically looking at specific stuff on the test, like, is the difficulty appropriate? Is the test internally consistent, right? Are the questions written well? The easiest, simplest example to give you would be the whole all the above. Awful. You never want to see that on a test because it's almost always the right answer. And it just, for lack of a better word, just makes a shitty test question. And so that's the stuff that's really quick and easy to pick out. But on top of that, looking at the internal consistency of the test involves a little bit more complex work. And so sometimes it certainly behooves us to partner with those who are in the field of statistics full time, or at least it's part of their day job. I don't know what you wanted to say about that, AD, but that's certainly at least my point of view.
Yeah. I mean, we do all this in house, so I'm not, but it's the same thing. Yeah. Our goal is, unfortunately, there's so much interdependence within psychometrics. So you've got all these independent tests that then rely on each other for information. It becomes really hard. So if you look at tools that exist, most of the tools when it comes to measurement will tell you each of these tests individually, but they won't give you that woven interdependence. That's really what our goal is our ability to say, here's how you should handle this. Here's what's going on here, and translate. That was the name of the company was from that, was that idea of metrics, taking metrics, and then the intersection of metrics and language verse, was that ability to translate that into something actionable and prescriptive and understandable, and so much of it is just sometimes incomprehensible to people.
Absolutely. Do you guys have any questions so far?
No, all very good information, and I can certainly identify with a lot of it, if not all of it. I was, in a previous life, I was part of a legal team that was responsible for redacting documentation. There was an incident that happened at a company that I used to work at where they were testing missile systems, and the missile system exploded on site. People died. And the only way that they were objectively able to measure whether people were properly trained or not was to determine if they actually learned the information that they were taught in their compliance training. Mm-hmm. So I was then at the time leading that team and going through the redaction process of all of the documentation, obviously, but at the same time, one of the major components during that investigation was to understand whether people, not only did they check the box and get the compliance training done, but did they actually learn anything along the way that may have mitigated, the incident that had happened. So I can totally see how this is valuable to any learning environment, especially in environments where the critical nature of the training is detrimental to the people that are working in the workspace. So.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's really where so much of the movement in that space is right now, obviously is in, a lot of around compliance and around things where it's either a requirement or it's a really wise proactive decision. But in all honesty, it applies everywhere, and it just makes a lot more sense in those situations like what you described. But that's really where we're trying to push, is that this applies at every learning level. It's just a matter of right now it seems to be catching on in the compliance space because it's such a requirement. So.
Right, and the sense of urgency, really, I think as learning professionals, I think it's important to really press that in the ROI development up front, and help people understand, especially leadership, to understand, look, if we don't do this, there's an impact on the business and an overall cost later on, potentially, if something goes wrong. So there's cost, there's cost savings on training, but there's also a cost avoidance that needs to be calculated as well. And if you can say, look, if this incident happens, it's going to cost you this amount of business and your brand is going to be run through the mud, well, then they might be more inclined to listen, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's huge. The secondary costs, like you just said, brand reputation damage, which
Sure.
a lot of times folks don't even think about, let alone the monetary penalties. And
It's always in my ROI development and models. I try to always talk about not just, how much money you're going to save by doing this training and what your business efficiency is going to be, but the cost avoidance piece is something that people have a tendency to look over, because it hasn't really actually happened yet. But if you understand the potential of that quote unquote bad thing happening to your business, any true business owner would care about knowing what that is and how to avoid it.
oh yeah, absolutely. You're ahead of the game if you're really thinking about those things. I can just tell you that from my own personal experience in terms of seeing what other learning professionals are doing. So that's awesome that you're taking that step, because I think you're thinking about it more holistically than most folks.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been doing this a while myself. You just come up with ways to make sure that your clients are happy with your work, right? And this whole talk is about measurement and not just implementation, which is everybody gets caught up on the implementation and the technology run, but these are things that need to be talked about. And in order for us to really impact the market space with training that is not just pretty or engaging, that is actually effective, and we can, tie a dollar value to its effectiveness and why it's important to businesses overall.
And that, I think, has got to be the change that we have to think about as an industry, is the ability to say just what you said. Here is how we're going to help enact that change. Here's how we're going to help enable that change. And here's how we're going to help optimize the potential for that change, as opposed to what we currently do, which is here is how we're going to contribute to that change, and here is how we're going to defend ourselves if it doesn't happen. Like, what a terrible model to really embrace as much as we have as an industry. So it's, for me,
absolutely, we're almost never operating from a position of authority, right? We're always very reactive. Look, we did the training. We don't know what went wrong. Now we got to go figure that out. Well,
yeah. And
these
now
conversations need to happen way up front.
Yeah, and so that's why it's always good to keep pushing that message out there. So I appreciate you doing that, Chris.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
no.
I have to just throw out our conversation earlier, AD and Chris, about some dissertation stuff I'm working on. This whole idea of effectiveness is coming back into something I'm thinking about. So I'm getting a lot from it, just all together, but yet back to what we were talking about now, where everything happens for a reason. So
Right.
Thank you.
You want me to let you share now, Chris? You want to get back to what you were going to talk
Yeah,
about?
sure.
All right.
I'll just go through an example here. All right. Is my screen back up?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So this is a real life example of where we applied a little bit, but I just say some advanced measurement statistically to a learning problem, or at least a problem in which learning was tangentially related, as you'll see from the example. It's an interesting one. So a client wanted to uncover how a location remodel and these are all renamed, at the Johnstown location, coupled with new customer service training, impacted overall satisfaction and how it correlated with sales, right? We told them right off the bat, these are probably not what you want to measure, but they wanted to go for that. And so we told them, look, you're going to only look at correlation, not causation, since we're talking about sales. And we identified some other metrics for them throughout the process that we thought might be better. However, of course, the client's always right when it comes to this stuff. And so we did run some analysis. And so what I wanted to show you here is what that actually looks like in practice when you're applying some statistical validity to it. So one of the things that you're seeing here is a range, right? And so the green line represents where the survey responses would fall if there was no difference prior to and after the intervention, right? So you can see it's right there vertically with 0. The horizontal black bar represents an interval that's 95% likely to contain the true difference. And so right off the bat, if anyone's giving you like a specific number, it's going to affect it by 17%, I would look at that side-eyed because it's just too specific. And so in this case, they're getting a range. Now, one of the things you can notice here, this black bar actually extends left of the 0 a little bit. Thankfully for them, it extends way further right, but that technically means you could actually have a negative correlation here, okay? Based on how this bar is laid out, it's an 80% chance that the change was positive, and the most likely value for the change was an improvement of about 1/4 of a point on their survey. This is one of the very reasons why we tried to direct them away from looking at customer satisfaction surveys. In this example, one, customer satisfaction surveys, net promoter scores, a lot of those, they have scales of 10, right? What's the difference between an 8 and a 9 or a 6 and a 7, really? It's very, very difficult to quantify. People tend to think in terms of like, it was the worst ever 0. You guys were okay, it was a 5, or I'm so happy 10, right? And so one of the things that you can see with the measures that they had us using, it produced an opportunity where we were getting very small intervals. Oh, sorry, let me go back one. So then we did a before and after. So the most likely value was the 0.26, like I said. It was an 80% chance that improved. This is just a closer view so you can see it. So that's a win, right? Well, first consider, does 1/4 of 1 point matter to the business? Is moving that satisfaction score 1/4 of a point valuable? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It depends. Another thing, where were they starting from? These 34 locations are all branches, and these are their satisfaction scores. What do you notice about all of them? Look at where they fall on this scale. They were all already pretty high. So now we're talking about going from an 8.5 to an 8.75 or something very small like that. The average branch earned an overall SAT score of nearly 9 out of 10 and had done so for long periods of time. So unless a slight movement in already high-performing metrics, say from a 9.1 to a 9.3, drives significant value, it's probably not a good goal to chase. So right there is yet another reason going after that's probably not the best thing. So then leadership also asked us to look at Central City, a specific location for comparison purposes. So think of it as like the control for the test store. We can see that the percentage of positive reviews at Johnstown is almost 10% higher than Central City. So at least that's a huge win, right? You can see quite a bit higher. 99.9% chance that it's going to be higher. Check out where the two compare, look at where the comparable group is to the test group. So I suspect, and obviously we didn't say it to them like this, but I suspect they gave us this location because they knew it was going to show a difference, right? And so if you're picking a bottom performer as the basis of your comparison and look at it against your control, which was kind of a middle performer, well, of course you're going to look good. And so that was just really very interesting. So Central City may have had a number of factors that led to the low score, right? We don't know why. Perhaps its customers were more comfortable leaving negative feedback. Perhaps they're irritable because they incur fees more often, right? That might have nothing to do with any kind of training experience. Perhaps the branch is missing a desired feature such as an ATM. Regardless, it didn't offer a good basis for comparison. It wasn't apples to apples. Even if it were more middle of the pack, it still is only a single example. And so what we shared with them is you'd want to repeat that with additional branches, of course. And we recommended we would go after something other than OSAT, to be honest. And so in our report out to them, here's what we shared. We were very upfront and honest and basically said, so customer surveys, while valuable, they're not ideal. The employees performed so well by the measure that they had virtually no room for improvement. So basically what I just shared with you earlier, if you're going from a 9.1 to a 9.3, isn't really going to show you significant value into the effectiveness of training or any other intervention. I want to call that out there. Adding a new product, same thing, right? It doesn't matter if this was training, that just happened to be what we were measuring. Overall satisfaction scores carry the inherent challenge of depending upon consumer psychology, the complex and often irrational concept, right? And Johnstown further exacerbates this already significant factor as it's a single location with specific service type, concierge. We stopped, we basically said, look, you guys aren't going to want to run a sales correlation, right? Because we didn't want to just take their money because it still wouldn't be a good move. And one of the things that we talked about in this instance, we didn't have enough information to go anything beyond a correlation. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen this site before. It's called Spurious Correlations. Just because you have a correlation doesn't mean you have a win. This is an example where someone literally showed number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. The graphs really closely correlate. I'll show you real fast. There's an entire website of these that are just hilarious. And they're all real. Let me expand this a little bit. So we had suicides by hanging, strangulation and suffocation, and U.S. spending on space, science, and technology. This is one of my favorite. Number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Divorce correlates with margarine consumption. I think this might be one of my favorites. Age of Miss America correlates with murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. I love how it even drops and rises together. So the point is, while correlation can be a valuable thing, taken out of context, it can also be a very dangerous and misleading thing. So potential metrics of value in the previous example that we pointed to them might be a better look at how the training drove impact. Duration of the transactions, right? So if one of the things they're trying to fix through this training was the speed to solution or speed to resolution for the customer, right? So let's actually look, how long is the average transaction? Is it taking the banker 5 minutes to do something that should be 2? Because as you can imagine, people value their time a lot. Frequency of escalation to the supervisor. There's lots of costs associated with that, both hard and soft, in terms of reputation of brand, as Chris mentioned earlier, not to mention the cost of having a supervisor have to jump into the situation. Future transitions with the customer post-complaint resolution. So these were just examples that we said, look, you guys aren't tracking these things today, or you're sort of tracking them in the case of duration. We recommend focusing some energy capturing these metrics because that would be a better indicator of your training success. This we kind of just talked about how correlation can be misleading or at worst irrelevant. So satisfaction measures are useful. Personally, I think performance-based metrics are much more useful than satisfaction because you're removing the psychology. And by removing the psychology, you're removing a lot of the variance. And this is a real key takeaway. There's one sentence I'd love for you guys to take away from this presentation. In most cases, we are measuring training-enabled change. The training is accompanying something, right? It's going to be new tech, a new process, a new regulation that you have to comply with, a new way of doing something. Never is the training just totally in a vacuum for training's sake, at least not in the organizations. And then the final thing I wanted to bring up here, we don't talk about this a lot, but have you guys noticed the micro-learning trend blowing up all over the place? So what's interesting about that is I've seen a million discussions about it in terms of the effectiveness of it from a learning standpoint, right? But what would be interesting is to also look at micro-learning as a kind of fidelity test, right? And what I mean by that is similar to the way like a web designer might create different versions of a web page to see what drives the most results, the most traffic, the most purchases, etc. Learning professionals would do well to kind of think similarly in terms of, do we really need this half-day instructor-led class? Will a 25-minute learning suffice? What about a simple performance support tool like a job aid? The answer to these questions have huge ramifications around opportunity cost, which is something that people don't talk about a lot in the learning space, but if they did, it would give us more information to sit at the head of the table, like AD was saying, because this is the type of foresight that business executives love, right? I'll give you an extreme example, but I've seen training initiatives at a giant organization like a Walmart, right? Opportunity cost might be $2 billion because they literally have 1.5 million associates. And so if it's an enterprise-wide initiative, and you got a half-day training, you can see how fast that stuff adds up, right? Another example in the news a couple years ago was Starbucks. Do you guys remember when they shut down their entire fleet for that whole day training because they had a bunch of incidents, right? And not saying that they didn't need to train to it, they did. But the way that they went about it was, all right, we're not going to actually look at what the problem is and analyze it and come up with a learning solution. It was, we're just going to shut down the entire fleet for the day and we're going to train everybody the exact same way. One size fits all approach. There's a huge cost to that. So in that case, it was the cost of the employee's salary, not to mention the lost sales. And so all of these things that I'm trying to get at have implications at a much bigger organizational level than just our space and training. And we just do well to really start thinking that way. And that's, I see we're coming up on 8 o'clock, and so I don't want to keep rambling on, but really that's philosophically where we're coming from. And I hope to see more folks in our industry start to take some to this approach, because it is frustrating to a degree to see how beaten down some folks in the learning space are in terms of, I feel like I have to fight all the time to get the seat at the table. I feel like we're the first ones cut when things go bad. I'm not sure how to do about it. We're viewed as a cost center instead of a revenue driver. Well, these are ways that we can kind of reshape the conversation, I think, if we go about it the right way.
Agreed. I think that in order for the training component of any business to become really the fabric of the organization, I think those conversations absolutely need to be had. And it sounds like you guys have been a huge proponent of it. I'm glad to hear that I'm not the only one sitting in the C-suite office saying the same exact thing. Like, you guys can't have this meeting without me. Like, you can't go through your 53 objectives for the year and not include learning and development as a component of that. Quite frankly, how do they? I asked one CEO, I said, well, how do you expect to deploy the technology across the entire country without training? Like, please, someone explain to me how that's going to happen. So these are very hard conversations to have, and we almost have to have the courage to speak up and say something about it, because at the end of the day, a lot of times, as you guys are saying, training is seen as an afterthought. It's seen as something that that gets taken care of after the implementation or after the change or after the research has been done. And that's just a recipe for disaster, because then we're stuck picking up the pieces, trying to get people up to speed, and then get pointed at when it doesn't work. So
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you're able to have those conversations. That's awesome. I wish more of us were.
yeah, so it's not easy, that's for sure. And I spent 20 years in the corporate world doing just that, fighting for a seat at the table to say, look, you guys can't not talk about this. Like, we have to have this discussion. Yeah, luckily for me, as an engineer, I was involved in a lot of those systematic changes for the business, but my learning and development hat was always on, and keeping the end user and the people top of mind. So it gave me the opportunity to express that in a room of tech junkies that only cared about getting it done.
Yes.
So I totally appreciate this talk, and thank you guys for putting it together. It was very comprehensive.
Oh, of course. Thanks for listening. We do appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much, guys. I really, really appreciate it. I imagine if anybody, for me personally, or anybody that watches the recording ever has any needs for metrics, ROI, training, development, return, they could reach out to you guys, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And Chris, even it sounds like you guys all have experience with that, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the part I love, because it makes it so much easier afterwards. We don't have to walk on eggshells. We know what it's going to do and how it's going to positively impact the business. If we have the opportunity to have the conversation up front, that's the caveat.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I haven't had too many of those situations for a whole program start to finish, but one I did have in the very beginning, before I really had much formal education, I did not take into account a lot of this stuff. So looking back on that, I'm like, there's so much I've learned since then, so I know what to do differently, and next programs I'm able to have a hand in. So thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night, and look forward to talking to you some more.
Yeah,
All
for
right.
sure. Let's
Have
all
a
connect
great
on LinkedIn if we're not connected yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure I reach out to you. And Carrie, just let us know where you end up posting the video, and I'll make sure I send out the link to our followers and promote it a bit.
Sounds good. Will do. Thank you again. You guys have a great evening and great rest of the week.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.